As you can see from the screen behind me, the title of my message I gave this week was Stress Relief. I went through about 4 different titles till I decided on one that I felt suited my message the best. And it's funny because when you pick a topic to speak on, it seems to be you live it that week, don't you? You know what I mean? I wish I'd spoke on prosperity or overwhelming joy. But I decided to speak on Psalm 37 and title it Stress Relief, and it has been quite stressful for myself this week and for others in the church. I've been aware of the needs of the church as well. But I want to talk about this because medical professionals say that the goal is not to have a stress-free life. We often say that, don't we? Oh, to have a stress-free life. And the goal isn't to have a stress-free life because medical professions say you need a little bit of stress to keep you going. No stress at all will kill you because you'll give up and shut down. And I was talking to Anthony about that before the service, about when you retire, if you don't have a purpose, then people give up. And so you need a little bit of stress, little. That's not what I'm talking about this morning. I want to talk about the times where we are overwhelmed and where it's unhealthy and where it affects our emotions and our attitude and our actions and our well-being. That's what I'm talking about, that kind of crippling effect. And I'm also talking about this morning the kind of stress that comes to you that you know you've got no control over. You're still affected by it, and it's worse to some extent because you can't change it and have no control over it. And so then you feel powerless. And that causes stress even more. And so we know that in the secular world, if you went to see a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a counselor, there are certain things they would tell you to be able to do that will give you coping mechanisms. We know that going outside and not staying in too much and getting out in the sun does you good. Vitamin D is good for you. The summertime is better for a lot of people who are perhaps struggling and depressed because it's lighter nights and the sunshine. They tell you to go out for a walk amongst nature. Some people say retail therapy, that helps. Yeah. Others say, yeah, just taking the dog for a walk, spa weekend, holidays. And all of these are good things physically for us. And there are a lot of things that we can do. But obviously, as Christians, I say to myself, well, where does it talk about this in the Bible? And what do we do from a Christian perspective? Because I'll enjoy going for walks. I'll do a spa weekend. I'll do some retail therapy. I'll do all of that. But spiritually, how do we deal with our souls? Because that's where the emotion is. That's where the stress is. That's where the anxiety wells up from. And so some of those things are good, but they only treat the symptoms. They don't treat the cause. And so I thought to myself, what did people in the Bible do? Because stress has always been there. And some of the people in the Bible have more stress than we'll ever know. And so I went to Psalm 37. It's King David. And so sometimes I remind myself, if I feel stressed as a pastor, he must have been even more stressed as a king. And he didn't have it easy, and he didn't, even though he was appointed to be king, we know by the time he actually became king, he went through an awful lot. And even as a king, he went through an awful lot. And so that kind of weight of responsibility came with anxiety. And so let me read to you some of Psalm 37 to show you. This is David, King David in the Old Testament, one of the greatest kings of Israel. He says, "Do not fret because of evildoers, nor be envious of the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass and wither as the green herb." Then he goes on in that psalm to say, "Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who brings wicked schemes to pass. Cease from anger and forsake wrath. Do not fret, it only causes harm." And I wonder sometimes how much our health has been affected because we've allowed these emotions to overwhelm us to the point that they make us ill. And it's a big thing at the moment with well-being and just helping even children who are feeling overwhelmed, anxious. Talking to one mum this week at the school, and she was in tears telling me how anxious her little boy is. and he's not going up to the comp for another 2-3 years. But she's already worried sick about the transition because he won't be able to cope and where he's going to go. And I was talking to her, and she was in tears just talking to me, and she said, I'm sorry I've got so upset. I said, it's fine. And to me, that's my pastoral work. I'm pastor in the community. That's what I'm there for. But you could see the anxiety on her and on her little boy, who's the same age as Ruby, 8 years old. You know, they shouldn't have a care in the world at that age, should they? The biggest stress should be is, when can I get out and play football? When am I going to see my friends? Have I got all my Pokemon cards? But we live in a world that it seems to be affecting more and more. And David knew this, and he talks about a kind of stress here that you can't control, manage, or manipulate. Do not fret about evildoers. What can you do? Because the world will always have people who do evil. He says, do not be envious of the workers of iniquity. Because as a king, he looks out and he sees people who are violent and evil and doing things that are against the purposes and plans of God. And not only does he see them doing these things, he actually sees them prospering. How many of you know that's hard to deal with? When you see someone who's done something horrendous and yet seems to get away with it, or they still seem to prosper, or they still seem to be blessed, in the sense of not God blessed, but blessed in life. And you think to yourself, I don't understand. And I'm sure we've all asked that. And I'm sure David, when he's speaking from this psalm, he's speaking from experience of that. I remember when all the stuff about Jimmy Savile came out, and we remember that, and we remember all that went on there. And someone said to me, but he got away with it, didn't he? Because he died and then he came out. So we never got justice for those people who suffered abuse, because he got away with it. And I want to say to you, but did he? Did he get away with it? We'll see about that in a moment. Because people will prosper who are evil. People will do wicked schemes and bring them to pass. We see the war in Ukraine. We see the war in Gaza. We see things going on in the world that can cause great anxiety, and you think, how do they seem to be able to get away with it and prosper? And how do I deal with these external things that are affecting me internally that I cannot control? And David, even as a king, he had a lot of authority, he had a lot of power, and he could bring a lot of change and stop a lot of things, but even he was limited. Because you can't stop people doing what they want to do. You can bring in laws and decrees, and you can bring in punishment, but at the end of the day, you can't stop them. If they want to do it, they will do it. And David knew this. The Bible says the heart is wicked and evil above all things. Who can know it? And so I think, as I read this psalm, and I try to picture myself sitting with David as he's writing this, I think he's thinking to himself, instead of trying to micromanage all of this, I can't do that. What I've got to do is manage my emotions and how I allow this to affect me. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. How do we allow it to affect us? How do we manage us instead of trying to manage the world? Ivan's at the back, and he often says to me, Dale, you can't control the uncontrollables. He always says that to me, and it's absolutely true. You can't control the uncontrollables. And the worst thing is trying to, because that brings greater anxiety, greater stress, and greater frustration. And you can't. So you've got to come to a place and say, well, how do I manage that then? What do I need to do? And so let me share a couple of things with you that I think David discovered through a life of stress and anxiety himself, and how he managed that and became a man after God's own heart, fulfilled all the purposes of God in his generation, and then he died. What a fantastic testimony. Didn't say he tried to fulfill them, and he gave up, or he got so stressed he had a breakdown and couldn't do it. It says he fulfilled them. Even though in the midst of all that stress, he fulfilled it and did what God wanted him to, and then He went to spend eternity with God. So number one, it says this, verse 3, it says, trust in the Lord and do good, dwell in the land and feed on his faithfulness. And so I think David is trying to say to us, look, there will always be evil in the world. There will always be stress in the world. There will always be anxiety and things going on that we don't like and we can't control and we can't stop. But one thing I can do is decide where my focus is going to be and how I'm going to fuel that and how I'm going to deal with it. And he says, I've discovered this, that trust is a great way to do that. Because although I can't control everything and I can't micromanage everything and I'm not in charge of the universe and everything that goes on, but I know a man who is. We serve a God who is. It says his throne is unshakable. He sits on the throne and controls everything and is in charge of everything, and he works out all things. And he knows the beginning from the end, and he's bringing it all according to his plans and purpose. God knows what he's doing. And so David came to the point and said, you know what? I'll trust you. I'm the king of Israel, but you're the king of kings. You're the king of eternity. You're the king of the universe. And so I'm going to put my trust, my faith, my belief in you, that you are good and you are faithful, you are able, and you are sufficient for all things. And the things I can't control, I'll leave with you. And you can work them out. Because I can't do anything about them. So I'm not going to try and control the uncontrollable. I'm going to leave that to God. And we all know the saying, let God be God. And so we talk about trust a lot, but I don't know if we actually practice it a lot. Because it's good in theory, but it's harder in practice, especially when you're in those times that are stressful and difficult and you feel like you have no control. And all you can do is trust. But it's not so easy to do that. But if we can bring ourselves to that place where we say, God, you are still God in this. Even though I don't understand, even though I'm confused, hurt, angry, whatever's going on, I'm going to trust because of who you are, your character, your goodness, your track record, your faithfulness. I read your promises. I read the stories of what you've done for Old and New Testament saints and people who've gone before me. I've got no reason not to trust you. And so in this, I'm going to trust. And notice this, as I was reading this, it's funny, we'll jump on the word trust in the Lord, and it's right throughout the Bible, and especially Proverbs, trust in the Lord and lean not on your own understanding, trust in the Lord, trust. But as I was reading this, I felt God say, wait a minute, there's more. It's more than just trust as well. He says, trust in the Lord and do good. And do good. Do you know what I think David was saying was? Leave those things you can't change to God and just get on with the things you can change and can do and make a difference. Because fear cripples us, anxiety cripples us, and we stop serving, we stop doing, we shut off, we shut down. And David says, don't do that. Do the opposite. Keep making a difference. Keep fulfilling your purpose and your calling. Keep yourself busy. Even psychologists will say that. I remember a pastor saying he spoke to a friend of his who was a psychiatrist or psychologist, and he said, what's the best advice I can give to someone who struggles with depression and anxiety? He says, tell them to get out and volunteer and do something for someone else. He said that's one of the best things they can do to help them cope, is to take the attention off themselves, focus on something else, have a purpose, and focus on that. And David had said that thousands of years before. Trust in God, leave those things with him that you cannot change, and get on with doing good. We all know the saying, for evil men to prosper, all it takes is for good men to do nothing. And David's saying, there's a lot of evil people out there, there's a lot of wicked people and things happening, and this is causing me anxiety, but I'm going to trust God, and what I'm going to do is do the opposite. I'm going to do good. I'm going to be an agent of good. And I'm going to live for God. I'm going to do the things of God. I'm going to make sure that, as far as I'm concerned, there are acts of kindness, there are acts of respect, the love of God is shown and demonstrated, and I'm going to do good. And I'm not going to allow the wicked to prosper or the wicked to just carry on and dictate. I'm going to do something good. And as we channel that anxiety and that sense of, what can I do about this? We focus it into being able to make a difference. And you might say, well, I can't make much of a difference. I'm not a king. I don't have that much influence. I don't have that much energy, that much time. But as we've often said, God can use a little to do a lot. And if you were doing good is just helping one person, that's okay. If you were doing good is just serving in one area, that's okay. But do something. Do something. Trust God with what you cannot control and fuel that energy of, instead of sitting in the house dwelling on it, instead of allowing it to overwhelm you, say, look, I'm going to pour this into something good. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and feed on his faithfulness. Remind yourself that God has never let you down. He's never forsaken you and he's never given up on you, and his promises have been fulfilled. He has a perfect track record. David is saying this, I can trust because he is trustworthy. I have no reason not to. Feed on his faithfulness. I find it interesting he uses the word feed, because that's what our emotions do. That's what stress does. That's what anxiety does. It feeds on things, doesn't it? Someone I knew who had a breakdown said they went and spoke to a counsellor, and the counsellor said to them, stop watching the news. It's feeding your anxiety. Stop watching it. It's not helpful for you. And so we say, well, what am I feeding on? And David said, I'm feeding on the faithfulness of God, because it reminds me that God is working out his purposes and is still in control. Your life is not out of control. It's out of your control, but there's a difference of it being out of your control and being out of control. You get what I'm saying? Or are you looking at me like, Dale, I don't know what you're doing now. You should have went to bed earlier last night. But that's the difference. We think our life is out of control, but it's not, because it's still in his hands, under his authority, and according to his power. Just read the book of Job, a man who suffered greatly, lost everything. But his life wasn't out of control, because when we read the story, it gives us a picture of heaven and a glimpse of what's going on spiritually. And God was in control the whole time. It wasn't out of control. It was very, very difficult and very, very painful. But it wasn't random. He wasn't at the mercy of the enemy. He wasn't at the mercy of fate and life that we talk about sometimes. God was doing something even in the midst of that. Okay, I got to move on quickly because I got to cover a couple of other points. Principle number 2, trust in the Lord and do good. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. I kind of inferred this just now when I said what you feed on. And the word delight simply means to take great pleasure in, to enjoy, to find as your source of happiness. And so David is saying this. He says, I'm going to take delight in my God. I'm going to enjoy God. I'm going to enjoy my relationship with him. I'm going to take great pleasure in him so that he can then be the one who influences my heart. Not the one who gives me everything I want, what the verse can sound like that. He'll give you the desires of your heart. What do you want? Just enjoy God and he'll give you it. It doesn't mean that. He says, enjoy God, delight in him, feed upon him, allow him to be the center and the focus of all you do, and he will influence and put his very desires in your heart. So those desires of perhaps bitterness and envy that David talked about and he experienced, and those anxious thoughts and those anxious desires and emotions suddenly are quenched and subdued because he's delighting in God. And so the presence of God and the power of God and the word of God as we meditate upon it, as we bring ourselves to Him. And it takes discipline and it takes choice. You won't always feel like doing this, and you won't always want to do it, and you may sometimes not even do it. But as much as you can, feed yourself, delight yourself in the things of God, so that that can influence your heart and protect you. See, Proverbs 4:23 says, guard your heart above all else. Why? Because it directs the course of your life. Because what's in your heart will come out, and what comes out will direct your life. We're all led by what's in our hearts. And so David says, I can't change everyone, and I can't stop all things that are evil and wicked. But you know what? I can live with a measure of peace and contentment and joy, even in the midst of this, because God is in control, and I'm just delighting in who He is. And sometimes you have to do that. It is good sometimes to switch off the TV and not listen to any more news. Over the last couple of weeks, I've gone down the Trump rabbit hole. And Ellen had to say to me, that's enough now, Dale, I'm sick of hearing his voice. Because you get a little bit obsessed by it, because I'm totally amazed by him, not in a good way. Absolutely amazed. And so I get caught up in it. And since the Zelensky interview, I got caught up in all that. But at some point, you've got to say, okay, enough now. I need another voice that's much more important. I'm delighting myself in the wrong things. And sometimes we've got to stop scrolling on social media. We've got to stop playing the games. We've got to switch off our PlayStation. We've got to switch off the TV. We've got to switch off what. And sometimes you've got to say, you know what? My emotions are a little bit out of balance. What can I do to help steady them and bring stability? If a ship is at sea and there's rough waters, the modern ships, they've got what they call stabilizers, that they lower each side to bring greater stability to their ship in times of turmoil and in times of storm. So if the sea is calm, they don't need them. But when the sea gets rough, and perhaps there's a storm, they lower these stabilizers to bring greater stability. And sometimes you can be on these ships and you feel like you don't even know you're at sea. And then other times then you're reminded that you're on there. But these stabilizers, and in life we need stabilizers. We need to lower things at certain times and say, I'm going through a difficult time. I'm going through a stressful time. My emotions seem to be, what do I need to do? What are the stabilizers I can lower? David says, one is called trust. The other is called delight. Do you trust God with your life? Are you delighting in Him? Are you in that place of relationship and fellowship so He can influence your heart? Because these things will creep in if we allow them. The world will spill over into our life. And we'll get overwhelmed. But when we delight in God, He stops us from being overcome. And He helps us. Thirdly, He says, commit your way to the Lord. Trust also in Him, and He shall bring it to pass. How many of you get frustrated sometimes when your best laid plans don't work out? How many of you have had an idea of how things are going to go? Even on a Sunday today, you might go home and say, right, Monday I'm going to do this, Tuesday I'm going to do that. I've got my week planned out. And then you'll get up tomorrow, you'll have a phone call, or someone will knock, and it'll throw your whole week. Your best laid plan. I had that this week. A friends of ours were picking the kids up from school for us, taking them to their home for tea. And so we had from 9 o'clock till about 6 o'clock, no kids. That was fantastic. I love my kids, but I enjoyed the fact I had no kids for an extra 3 hours. Friend said, I'll take them, have a break. So I was sitting in the house, watching some TV, talking to Helen, we're having some dinner. And I thought to myself, I got a good few hours now to get my sermon done, get things prepared. There's no distractions, no noise, it's okay. And one phone call blew it out of the water. A friend of mine who was over from America phoned me and said, can we come and see you? That was my afternoon gone. No sermon preparation. Couldn't binge watch my favorite program. Couldn't have 5 minutes to myself. Didn't see it coming. Didn't plan for it because I couldn't. But suddenly, blew everything out of the water. I'd had the whole day planned. And in a moment, it changes. David says, commit your way to the Lord. Why? Because you don't know the future. You don't know every step. So what you've got to do is give it to the one who does and allow him to work it out. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to achieve. Even in church context, I can stand up here and say, cast a big vision and say, this is what I want Hope Church to be. This is where I want us to go in 2025. But there's only so much of that I can bring that God may fulfill. Because it may be my vision, but God says it's not quite going to work like that. Or it's not going to happen the way you think it is. Or it's going to take longer than you think. And along the way, you're going to get frustrated. You know, you talk about growing and then the church gets smaller. And you think this is the opposite of what we're trying to do. But it doesn't mean that we can't get there. But it's frustrating. And if you're a leader, you want to accelerate that and things happen tomorrow. And God says, no, you've got to be patient. And so you've got to come back and say, well, this is what I want. This is my vision. This is my heart. And I believe it's aligned with your will, but I've just committed it to you, Lord. Because some of it may be me, and some of it may be what I want and in my time, but I've got to take my hands off it and leave it go and say, Lord, I'll commit it to you. And so if it doesn't go the way I think it should, that's okay, as long as it's going the way you think it should. That's what it means to commit your way to the Lord. It says, he shall bring it to pass, not you. And so perhaps for some of us this morning, we've got to stop trying to manipulate things. We've got to try and stop making things happen and trying to work things to happen. And just step back and say, God, I'll allow you to be God. And in your time and in your way, you'll bring it to pass. But I acknowledge that your thoughts are higher than my thoughts. Your ways are higher than mine. And so I don't always know what you're doing and how you're going to do it. But I don't need to, because we go back to the first point. I trust. I delight. I know you. I trust you. I take great pleasure in you. Therefore, I can surrender it all to you. And then lastly, when you do that, you come to a place of rest. Trust, delight, commit. And he says, rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. The word fret in the Bible means to get all worked up. That's literally the translation from the Hebrew, to get all worked up. And so David is saying, don't get all worked up. How many of you know that doesn't help, especially when you're getting worked up? Never say to your husband or your wife, stop getting all worked up, because they'll probably strangle you, because it doesn't help. No one's ever calmed down by being told, calm down. We do need to be told this sometimes. But David is saying, don't get all worked up. Don't fret. Don't be overwhelmed. And he finishes with these thoughts of rest. And the word rest there is a specific word, and it means the rest of silence. That's what it means. It doesn't mean just sitting down and doing nothing. It specifically means the rest of silence. So what are we talking about? We're talking about coming to a place where we've trusted, we are delighting in God, we are taking great pleasure in him, we've committed all that we're doing to him and allowing him to work it out, not us. And then we are resting in silence so that we stop complaining, we stop grumbling, and we stop telling God what he should be doing and allow him to be God. We silence ourselves. There's a great passage about Jesus, and it says this. It says he was led as a lamb to the slaughter. And what does it say? He opened not his mouth. He could have opened his mouth. And he said himself, I could call 10,000 angels to stop this. He could have defended himself and said, you're crucifying an innocent man. He could have said, I'm the Son of God. Do you realize what you're doing to me? He could have done all sorts of things. But he says he opened not his mouth. Sometimes we have to come to that place where we are no longer going to defend ourselves. We're no longer going to try and vindicate ourselves. We're not going to argue the point. So a little cartoon this week where Jesus is dragging one of his disciples away, and he says, I've told you that you're supposed to win souls, not win arguments. And he's dragging him away from another person. I call you to win souls, not win arguments. To silence. You say, but it's my reputation at stake. Well, as long as it's not your character. Your reputation people can destroy through lies. They can't change your character. You know who you are and what you've done. And sometimes you have to let God vindicate you. You have to let God defend you. You see sometimes people protesting for God, protesting against things in the world that are evil or against God's will. And I'm not saying we shouldn't speak up and stand up for the things of God, but I don't need to defend God. God isn't insecure. Well, last time I checked anyway. He's not insecure about who he is. I don't have to fight every battle. I don't have to defend every cause. I don't have to argue every point. Sometimes the best thing we can do is be quiet, be still, and say nothing, and just allow God to be God. And that's what David is saying here. He says, rest in the Lord. Silence those voices, silence the complaining, silence the need to be heard and to speak and to shout and to try and defend and win. He says, stop that. Come to a point where you just say, okay, I don't need to do this. I know that what I'm doing is right. God knows what I'm doing is right. He knows my heart, and he will justify me. He will vindicate me. He will fight my cause for me. And so Jesus opened not his mouth, but was led like a lamb to the slaughter. And so this morning, I think if we apply those 4 points of learning to trust a little bit more, of learning to take pleasure in the things of God, and knowing when to turn the things of the world off, so we are influenced by the right things. Someone said to me before that when he was pastoring, a guy came on to him and said, I'm awful depressed. And I seemed to get him worse. And he said, okay. He said, well, what do you like doing? What are your hobbies? He said, I love Nazi memorabilia. And he said, I keep reading about Nazis and the Jew and the Germans and the Holocaust. And he said, well, I'm not surprised you're depressed. And he never made a link between the two. And he said, well, I suggest you stop doing that. As much as history can be fascinating and it's good to know history, do you know there's some things you don't need to delve into too deeply. Ruby's doing history in school and they're talking about World War II. She said, can I Google Hitler? I said, no, you cannot. Because there are some things she doesn't need to know. She's too young to know. I don't want her to expose to it because it's toxic. And it can poison us. And so we have to come to that point where we delight in the right things and commit what we want to the will of God. Because it may not be what he wants. Someone said, hold things loosely and not too tight. And that's hard sometimes. But sometimes you've got to hold things loosely because God may say, well, okay, you can have that, but I'm going to take this. And I'm going to fulfill that, but I'm going to change this. And actually, it's not going to go in that direction. It's going to go in this direction first. And so you have to allow that. And it's only then that we can rest. Because we've trusted and given it to God. Sometimes those who speak the loudest are in the most turmoil and have the most anxiety. And I think sometimes we think if we shout loud enough, it'll make things better. And God says sometimes, just stop. It's okay. Just stop. I'll work this out. Just trust me. The rest of silence. said to someone the other day, as I'm getting older, I just want a quiet life. I haven't got the same fight. Don't want to do the same battles. But in a sense, that's good. Because when you're younger, you're up for anything. And sometimes you fight fights that you shouldn't have fought. And you do battle when you didn't need to. But as you get older, you think, you know what? I have an opinion on that, but I don't need to be heard. I have an opinion on this, but I don't need to really put it on there. I can see all these things on Facebook and the platforms of everyone sharing their opinion of Trump. They'll share their opinion of the Ukraine war, of Gaza, of what. Sometimes you just think, I have an opinion, but I don't need to go there. Protect your well-being, protect your emotions, balance things out. Stress relief. These are the things that will help you to relieve the stress in your life. They won't take it away completely. And life will always have its pressure points and stresses. But these are the things that help David bring relief. Trust, delight, commit. What was the last one? Someone remind me. Rest. See, get my own points. When we do that, it makes life so much easier to live with the unknown, the uncertain, and the uncontrollable. Because that's how life is, folks. And we put all our energy into the wrong things. I can't change everything, but I can change me. I can't stop everything from happening, but I can stop how I respond and what I allow to affect me. Let's pray.